Stop.
Now it's time for crazy editorial number 2. So again, you wonder why Trump wins. You wonder why Republicans win even though they're really bad at everything. And why is it that Republicans keep winning even though they're really bad at everything? It's because the left has gone crazy. Now, there are a couple of charts out there that show the Democratic and Republican Party splits, meaning where the right has moved and where the left has moved. And what the charts show is that basically since 2010, the Republican Party has been static, but the Democratic Party has been moving wildly to the left. They've been moving solely to the left. So the greater partisan polar gap that's being created right now is being created by the left moving hard to the left, not by the right moving harder to the right. Okay, so with that in mind, here is crazy column number 2. So this one is courtesy of some weird guy named Tim Kreider over at the New York Times. He's an essayist. He's a professional essayist, which is to say he reads a bunch of stuff that the New York Times pays him for, but the only people who read him are people who sit there with their cat and their cup of coffee at brunch on Sunday morning on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. He penned an op-ed that is, I mean, this is a crazy op-ed. It's called, "Go Ahead, Millennials, Destroy Us." No, I am not kidding. That is the name of the op-ed, and it is not a good op-ed. Shockingly, you may have thought that from that title it would be a great op-ed. You would be wrong. It is, in fact, a terrible op-ed. So let's go through how bad this op-ed is. Okay, this op-ed apparently came out, I guess, March 2nd, 2018, so it's a little bit old, but it's still worth commenting on. So it's over the last week and a half. He says, "As with all the historic tipping points, it seems inevitable in retrospect. Of course, it was young people, the actual victims of the slaughter, who have finally begun to turn the tide against guns in this country. Kids don't have money and can't vote. And until now, burying a few dozen a year has apparently been a price that lots of Americans were willing to pay to hold on to the props of their pathetic role-playing fantasies. But they forgot what the adults always forget, that our children grow up and remember everything and forgive nothing." And then you just get a weird, eerie cue from Children of the Corn. It's all weird. Okay, so let's point something out. This whole idea that children are going to lead us is incredibly stupid. We don't listen to children on anything. And now, people will say about me, well, you know, you were writing a syndicated column when you were 17, right? And I was getting shellacked for the stuff that I was saying, sometimes deservedly so. I don't believe everything that I wrote at 17 because no one does. And if you do, it's because you have lost the capacity to change and the capacity to think. As we get older, we have more life experience, and very often that means we get wiser. The notion that a bunch of Americans are sitting around completely blasé about the murder of school children in Parkland, Florida, is just insane, and that a bunch of kids realize that their parents don't care about them, well, that seems really stupid to me. Anyway, Kreider writes, "Those kids have suddenly understood how little their lives were ever worth to the people in power, and they'll soon begin to realize how efficient and endless are the mechanisms of governance intended to deflect their appeals, exhaust their energy, deplete their passion, and defeat them. But anyone who has ever tried to argue with adolescents knows that in the end, they'll have 1,000 times more energy for that fight than you, and a bottomless reservoir of moral rage that you burned out long ago." So Tim Kreider is basically the hippie homeless guy who hangs out outside the store and gives kids money to buy him beer. And then all the kids think, oh, that guy's cool because he also gave me a beer. Right? He bought, and I got him a six-pack inside, and then sorry, it's the reverse. He's the creepy homeless guy the kids give money to buy beers, and then he brings out the six-pack and he gives a six-pack to the kids. Right? That's who this guy is. Right? I smoke doobies with the kids, and then I'm the uncle at the barbecue, and I give the kids beer, and then I pat their back while they vomit into the bushes, and later their mom and dad say, "Stay away from Uncle Jim." Right? That's who this guy Tim Kreider is, because this is ridiculous. That sentence again. Have you ever tried to argue with adolescents? They have 1,000 times more energy for the fight than you and a bottomless reservoir of moral rage. Yeah, usually they're arguing in favor of having drugs and of taking drugs and having random sex with people and playing Xbox instead of doing their homework. That's usually what teenagers are arguing in favor of. But we're supposed to care about their bottomless reservoir of moral rage? Honest to God, if 16-year-olds ran the world would be even worse than it is right now. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this column because it gets even more insane than that in just a second. First, well, actually, you know, let's just keep going with that. Okay, fine. So here is, so he continues. "Like most people in middle age, I regard young people with suspicion. The young and the young at mind tend to be uncompromising absolutists. They haven't yet faced life's heartless compromises and forfeitures, its countless trials by boredom and ethical Kobayashi Marus, or glumly watched themselves do everything they ever disapproved of. I am creeped out by the increasing dogmatism and intolerance of millennials on the left. I felt a generational divide open up under me last year when everyone under 40 seemed to agree that Dana Schutz's painting of Emmett Till in his coffin should be removed from the Whitney Biennial. When I was young, it seemed the natural order of things that conservatives were the prudes and scolds who wanted books banned and exhibitions closed, while we liberals got to be the gadflies and iconoclasts. I know that whenever you disapprove of young people, you're in the wrong, because you're going to die and they'll get to write history, but I just can't help noticing that the liberal side isn't much fun to be on anymore. Yet." Right? So he acknowledges that people on the left, a lot of folks on the left, are not particularly tolerant. But then he continues, Yet this uprising of the young against the ossified, monolithic power of the NRA has reminded me that the flaws of youth, its ignorance, naivete, and passionate Manichaean idealism are also its strengths. Okay, so the fact that kids are dumb and Manichaean, that they see things in black and white, that's a strength, you see. Young people have only just learned that the world is an unfair hierarchy of cruelty and greed, and it still shocks and outrages them. They don't understand how vast and intractable the forces that have shaped this world really are, and still think they can change it. Revolutions have always been driven by the young. That's true, and most revolutions end in chaos and bloody murder. Most revolutions driven by young people end in absolute chaos, bloody murder, sometimes the murder of hundreds of millions of people in the case of communist revolutions. In the case of the French Revolution, they end with the guillotine. They always eat the old fogies who think that they're egging on the young. And Robespierre ends up on the guillotine just the same as the anti-Jacobins who ended up on the guillotine because of Robespierre. The revolutions that have done pretty well in human history tend not to be led by people who are 17. There was a disproportionate support for the Nazi Party among the young. The revolutions that tend to do pretty well, I'm talking here particularly about the American Revolution, are led by middle-aged people. The average age of the Declaration of Independence signees, or signers rather, was 44. That was the average age of the people signing the Declaration of Independence. There are about a dozen people who signed who are under the age of 35, but life expectancy in those days was also a lot lower, which is why the presidential age of limitation is at 35, because the idea was that you were a mature human being by 35. Even a 17-year-old in 1776 was probably the equivalent of a 25-year-old today in terms of maturity and responsibility. But this guy, Tim Kreider at the New York Times, he says, ever since Columbine, almost 20 years ago, I've absorbed the news of more mass shootings than I can count with an ulcerating rage that gradually scabbed over into a deadening cynicism. To those of us who have lived with the certain grim realities our whole adult lives, the widening moat between the rich and the rest of us, the sclerotic influence of money on politics, the NRA's unassailable coalition of greed and fear, they seem like facts of life as unalterable as death itself. Now, do you get the feeling that Tim Kreider has an agenda here? He might have an agenda, and he only likes young people who agree with that agenda. So, as I mentioned, there are a bunch of young students who actually don't agree with that agenda. In fact, by polls, young people tend to be more in favor of gun rights than older people. Young people, people who are below the age of 25, tend to be more in favor of concealed carry than older people. But my favorite thing here is he gets to the end of this ridiculous essay, and he starts basically lobbying for the young people to listen to him and then to build a statue of him, Tim Kreider of the New York Times. He says, the students of Parkland are like veterans coming home from the bloody front of the NRA's de facto war on children. Again, I'm getting very, very sick of the notion that everybody who is in favor of gun rights is responsible for Parkland. It's like right after JFK's assassination when the entire left decided that it was a bunch of Southern Republican rednecks who had shot JFK even though he was a communist. This is a complete misread. And we now have news that the Parkland shooter was reporting to the authorities. He was reporting to his teachers that he was having dreams of shooting his fellow students and walking around dipped in their blood. And the schools knew about it, and they did nothing about it. And there's a report from Real Clear Investigations last week showing that the Broward County schools had implemented new policies that were specifically designed to prevent the reporting of kids who are involved in misdemeanor crimes because they wanted to lower their crime stats. And it's the NRA's fault? But anyway, Tim Kreider finishes up. He says, my message as an aging Generation Xer to millennials and those coming after them is go get us. Take us down. All those cringing provincials who still think climate change is a hoax, that being transgender is a fad, or that socialism means purges and re-education camps. Rid the world of all of our outmoded opinions, vestigial prejudices, and rotten institutions. Gender roles as disfiguring as foot binding. The moribund and vampiric two-party system. The savage theory of capitalism. Rip it all to the ground. I, for one, can't wait till we're gone. I just wish I could live to see the world without us. Oh my God. Ugh. Just go away, dude. Yeah, first of all, I like when he says take us down, and then he says, I don't mean me. I mean everyone else. Right? I don't mean me. I mean all those crazy Republican conservatives who think things like socialism's bad, and like sex, there's such a thing as biological sex, and that maybe we shouldn't have the government run all of our industries because of climate change. It's truly amazing, but this is the virtue signaling that's going on the left. I mean, my goodness. Gender roles as disfiguring as foot binding. Okay, no one thinks that women are being foot-bound in Western society. Okay, the savage theory of capitalism that allows Tim Kreider to write his crappy columns rather than mopping up a stall with his discarded drafts, as he probably should be doing. And that discarded theory of capitalism is the only thing that separates Tim Kreider from absolute penury and poverty, considering the quality of his work. Meanwhile, so we've had the left advocating for full-scale revolution to rip down capitalism and gender roles. We have had the left advocating in favor of eugenics, of killing Down syndrome babies in the womb. And now we have a leftist named Elizabeth Bruning, who is advocating for socialism. So last week, as we talked about at length, she wrote an entire column advocating for socialism. She talked about how capitalism was deeply flawed and terrible, and we have to ensure that socialism has another chance. And I sort of took that column apart here on the program. I also wrote a piece about it, and she was very angry that I wrote a piece about it. Right? She got very mad that I wrote a piece in response to all of that. And what she was particularly mad about is that I pointed out that Venezuela, Cuba, Soviet Union, North Korea, China, these are not good countries to live. These are terrible places, and that socialism has a pretty long and bloody history. And I also pointed out, she didn't like this particularly, that a lot of the Nordic countries, a lot of the Scandinavian countries, you know, all the supposed socialist paradises are in fact largely either mercantilist, meaning state-sponsored capitalism, or fully capitalist systems with heavy redistributionism. If you're a socialist society, that is basically two things. That is full state ownership of the distribution of resources, and which means full state ownership of the means of production. Those are the two general principles of socialism, that the state owns the distribution of resources and also that the state owns the means of production.